looking at the screen. Oh,
Oh,
okay. It says we're live.
yeah, we're live. So this is a discussion. So I would say my position is one of soft libertarianism, and I'm going to be debating someone who self-identifies as a Marxist. So would you like to maybe give an overview of your ideology and your position, and we'll go from there?
It's a bit hard to describe an ideology, especially since there's quite a bit of misconception, especially in the West, about Marxist positions and whatnot. And once you clarify, if you don't properly understand some of the vocabulary, some of the jargon, it can seem quite scary. But as someone who grew up in the ideology, my grandfather was a party member. My dad was distanced himself somewhat because he was a bit more academically minded, but I did grow up in that environment, so I didn't have to go through the intro that a lot of my friends when I tell them, oh, I'm actually a communist, they're like, what the hell, like that makes no sense. You're a good person. I'm like, I know, but I suppose if you want to some positions, you could call me a Marxist Leninist with some grievances to what the Soviet Union did. I'm not uncritical of my leaders. I think nobody should be, but I do think that what Cuba, what the Soviet Union did, and what China has done,
Okay.
up until with some issues, I would agree with most of what.
Okay, I mean, I'm not too worried about labels. I just want to know what you believe, so you can sort of give an outline of your position. We can talk about economics. We can talk about the structure of the society that you want. We don't have to talk about labels. I mean, you can outline your principles in your own words if you want to do that. Do it that way.
I mean, like it's very vast. So like my positions on what, like on economics, I think that we need to stop looking at distribution from a scarcity perspective, and we need to start designing it such that you can you can collectivize things and people can be provided for in a better way, so that people can be more productive. Because currently there's a lot of economic waste of people because people can't work, or they're marginalized, or just the way that this current system works out, where but we're both losing out. Like the collective is losing out because we're losing out on a working body, and that working body is losing out because since he or she is not able to work, they cannot be compensated, and they cannot provide for themselves.
I mean, what society would you find to be the most desirable? What would be your ideal way things operate?
If you're familiar, like the idea of late stage full communism is the idea. It would be the perfect society. Whether or not socialism is a possible way to get to that, I think that would have to be a question for the future. But it's a bit of an odd question, because what would be your ideal society? Well, my ideal society would be one where it's perfect, and it's tough to approach that because, well, how do you get there? You know.
Well, I mean, I can tell you what I would desire. I mean, like, again, I understand that there's no such thing as a utopian society, but being a sort of conservative, you can kind of take that in a literal sense. I want to conserve what's quite good about what we have currently. So I do believe in the westernized, modernized model that we currently have. You know, a sort of mixed, almost social democratic or sort of hybrid capitalist type model. This is sort of what I'm going for. It's not a utopian by any means, but I think it's something that works pretty well. It has practically. It's practically effective for a large proportion of the society. So again, I think being a conservative is about conserving what we have. So this is broadly my position. And you say that you're a communist or a Marxist or something like that. But what I want to know is practically, what does this mean? I'm not saying that you have to.
Okay, I understand it. I understand the question.
I'm not saying that you have to construct a utopian society from an ideological framework. What I'm saying is, what would you, if you could take the steps towards a society that you want to have under your ideology, what would you do? What would be the end goal?
And go again, we get to the utopia. So I'd like to lay out some practical steps. Let's look at the United States, because it's where I currently reside for about a year more before I go back. And there is an economist that I quite like. His name is Richard Wolff, and he lays out a plan where he wants more legislation to be more welcoming to worker cooperatives. so that they can spring up. Then you have an economic base of people who work in cooperatives. And the idea is that this will naturally develop support for the cooperatives because his claim is that they are more egalitarian, that people prefer to work in those and whatnot. So he wants a bigger working cooperative sector, which in his view will lead to political support for a more leftist economic stance. And he claims that a party, if not a current party that will become more welcoming to them, a new party will spring up with the economic support of the working cooperatives, and those will both go naturally as they become more, they gain more economic and political power. So that would be my step, saying we should support working cooperatives so that we can slowly build up the support for this kind of society.
So would you like to maybe elaborate on what you mean by worker cooperatives? Do you mean nationalization of major industry? So you don't mean nationalization, you mean sort of a more
it can nationalization. I mean, if the government wants to come in and distribute the worker cooperatives, I'm not against that, but I don't think that's going to be happening in the United States. So I just mean that a business, large scale or small scale, where the decisions are done by the people who work there rather than someone who owns the property.
Okay, so the whole sort of socialist analogy of the workers taking control of the means of production.
You in a small scale.
With that allegory. So practically speaking, how would these businesses work? So you have all these workers that control all aspects of the business. Now, to me, that seems quite decentralized. Would the system be hierarchical in any sense? Would there be any sort of democratic element to the way in which these cooperatives are set up? So how would these structures be organized? Because to me, when you have a system where everyone controls everything, that seems quite disorganized. So how would you even try to achieve organization in these cooperatives? And if so, what kind of organization would you try and achieve?
Well, you don't have this already exists in certain countries in Latin America and some places in Europe. You don't necessarily have a lack of management. It's simply that the management is not necessarily the direct leadership. In order to have efficiency, you still have people who specialize on telling people what to do. It's just that once they can be held more accountable for their actions and whatnot. There'll still be hierarchies. Obviously, you can't get rid of all of them.
Oh, okay. Because I asked this question because I've debated a person before called Bad Mouse Productions.
I saw the debate.
Yeah, who very strongly argues against the concept of hierarchy. So I take it you would disagree with him on that you would be in favor of some kind of hierarchical structure within these cooperatives.
I quite like Bad Mouse, but I agree. I think I locally work with an anarchist group, and I've gotten them even to admit that there's still hierarchy in order to maintain some efficiency. I do agree with them though that the hierarchy is much less brutal and a lot more. It can be held to an account much more easily than the current system does.
So, I mean, how would you hold this to account? Because I suggested that one way of doing that would be to introduce more democracy into these cooperatives. So you would elect your managers, for example. Is that what you would suggest? Or some other system entirely? I mean, I don't really know what your position is. I'm just brainstorming here.
Yeah, you would elect the manager, and if the manager turns out to be quite rubbish or they're not doing a good job, then they are voted out and fired, and you find somebody else.
So let's say I start a small business from the ground up, and I'm the owner of that business, and let's say I employed 3 other people. Could they vote me out of my own business then?
Well, here we need some context. Are you doing it today? I believe you're from the UK. If you do it in the UK today, no, they wouldn't be able to.
Oh, no, I mean, in a society that works according to your framework. I mean, would I even be able to make my own business? Would that be possible in your communist, Marxist, or whatever society? Could I do that, for example?
You could be a government investor where you look at certain. You look at the central economic if you have a centrally planned economy, you look at the economic model and you say, okay, what do we need? What do we need? What do we have too much of that we can spend to make something else? And then you would be given a budget to start a business. You
Okay,
wouldn't.
because now you are talking about centralized management of the economy. So this kind of links into the sort of nationalization of state industries, that kind of thing. So are you saying that I wouldn't be able to create my own business? So let's say I have an idea for a new product that I think there's a gap in the market. I mean, maybe we don't have markets in that sense, but let's say
you would have. Actually, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go on.
Okay, but let's say I think of an innovative new product that I want to sell. Would I be able to do that? Would I be able to set up my own business to sell my idea, to sell my value-added product? Or could I do that, or would I have to be part of this state centralized organization to do that?
Well, you already have to be part of the state centralized organization to do that. You still need to follow certain regulations. You still need to do. You need to jump through some hoops. Here, you wouldn't have to risk your own. You would be provided with the materials in order to make your innovation. So the risk is different. Sure, you might have to go through some bureaucracy. However, you're not risking your livelihood just to make a new product to life.
I mean, this already happens in most West. I mean, the government does fund startups already. So again, I'm not really seeing too much difference here.
Well, the difference is in what kind of startups will be funded, because a lot of sure, the government does have a lot of investment, and I'm not against that. However, a lot of investment also comes from the private sector, and oftentimes that investment does not go into it often goes into things that can be marketable and that can be sold to a high profit, and very little that goes to help people that have very little money. That's an issue with the supply and demand in a capitalist society. The demand is personified with money, not necessarily with needs of the people.
Okay, but so what you're saying is that I would be able to set up my own business, but that business would have to be state owned. So I wouldn't actually own my own. I wouldn't actually own my own business. I couldn't.
I would. There's been a shift away from the very, very centralized model that the Soviets had, where this is a bit of it's a bit dumbed down. I don't know if you're familiar with how the Soviet Union ran, but it was more centralized than I would prefer. You do have the state that can veto things and whatnot. This is an oversimplification, but I don't want to get too much into it. However, the idea is that the final economic power relies in the unions and the cooperatives rather than in the government, and they can use that to sway when the government is up to fishy shit. So I would refrain from saying that the government owns the business. The government has a large say on the business, but the businesses are collectivized.
I mean, I can sort of, I'm beginning to understand more how this might apply to large corporations. But what I'm really struggling to see is how these ideas work for small businesses, because I'm starting to see a few contradictions. I mean, you said earlier that if I were to create that in a business, the cooperative is owned by the workers within it. So, and you talked about this democratic element as well, where people vote for the management. So again, how would this work from a perspective of, let's say I want to create my own small business? I can kind of see it from the perspective of, let's take Tesco, for example, and put it in the hand of the unions or whatever. But let's say I personally want to create a small business with a relatively small number of employees. How would that practically work? Would I be able to be voted out of my own business? Would I be able to, I don't know, sell shares to other investors? I mean, what kind of things would I be allowed to do?
Give me a concrete example. Do you want to just set up like a general store and sell?
No, well, let's say I want to set up like an online business. It's to sell a new product that I think, one of these startup corporations. I mean the kind of thing that you might see on Dragon's Den, for example. Just one of these small businesses. Not looking to make huge profits, not looking to employ a large number of people. Just half a dozen people being employed in a small venture, where I would sell to a small or medium-sized market. And I expect to be reasonably successful, but I don't expect to become one of these massive corporations. You know, I'm just a general innovator here. That this is from my perspective. How would I be able to function?
I'd say you have to go through some sort of bureaucracy.
And, I understand that,
and they would provide you with the resources. I don't see where the contradiction comes up. So, are you saying okay?
Because so I mean, this already happens.
Go back to if you would be voted out.
Yeah, I mean, this already happens because again, what I'm trying to see is the distinctiveness of your point you're making. But you talk about me having to go through the bureaucracy and having to go through these hoops, and you've already admitted to yourself that you have to do this anyway in a modern Western capitalist mixed democracy. This, you know, no small business has no regulations. We don't live in an untrammeled free market. Every small business has to abide by a certain amount of regulations. I'm not against that. I'm just trying to understand in your communist society how a small business would work in that framework. And I'm not really understand. We can move on. We don't have to continue. We don't have to labor this point. But
I think is your question just coming back to can you be voted out of the business you created?
Well, we can. I mean, can I be voted out of the business I created?
I mean. Yeah, but I'm assuming that this is a business you made with some friends or with some relatives or people you know, or perhaps you just hired some people. But if you're a bad manager currently, your business just wouldn't succeed. If you're a bad manager, you could be voted out. I don't see how this is a negative.
I mean, I'm not necessarily saying it's positive or negative. I'm just trying to understand how it would work.
Well, I mean, yeah, anybody can be voted out in this sort of model.
Okay, so you would have some kind of regulation, sort of more strict regulations.
Sorry, I should clarify. There's still regulations. You can't just vote out someone just because you don't like working with them. There are still like certain guidelines that you have to go through, mostly through the unions and whatnot.
Okay, I mean, okay, we can move and talk about something else, but because I don't want to spend the whole time talking about this. It's just I'm trying to understand that from a small business perspective. Again, I mean, it seems like I create a small business, and let's say I treat my employees very badly, that they can then vote me out. Simple as that. And then the state would ensure that their democratic decision is enforced.
Perhaps not the state. Perhaps an institution of the state. Because unions would become more of a state, part of the state apparatus. But it's odd to ponder about these things because what the state would entail, and it depends how far along we are. But the state would change quite a bit. You know, the state of feudalism is quite different than the state of capitalism.
Okay, I mean, yes, that's fine. I mean, so let's talk about something else that I think maybe you'll have an opinion on. So, what do you think about private property? In your system, would I be allowed to own my own private property?
Here we'd have to. This is a common question. Are you making the distinction between personal property and private property?
Okay, I wasn't going to make that distinction, but okay. I mean, I've already had this conversation with Bad Mouse, but
I saw the discussion. I would mostly agree with him there. That there's a difference to be made between something like something that you own and you use, rather than something you own and you leave off basically in the background of your mind to just be managed by people you employed. That is just naturally making money for you. That is not something that would be allowed.
Okay, so you're not allowed to own something where profit is being created.
Not necessarily where profit is being created. It's just something that you are not actively engaging in, and the idea of profit would be quite different in a transitionally socialist society. Ideally, it would be abolished.
Okay, so there wouldn't be profit then in your society.
Yeah, because profit is something that is derived from the scarcity of something. There is something that is supposedly scarce, so you have people working it, exploiting the resource, and you are exploiting the workers. That is the idea, that they provide a certain amount of work, and then let me just give a concrete example, because I'm mumbling over my words. Let's say you get the leather, you get some cotton, and you have 3 people make a boot, and they each get paid $30, and you sell the boot for $100. There's $10 there that was that you made, and let's say you didn't work in the boot. It was only the 3 people who worked on creating the boot. Those $10 you kept, and then the other 30 went to them. Why? What did you do to get the $30? You didn't work in the boot. You didn't distribute the boot. Let's say one guy created the leather, one guy put the boot together, and then one guy drove it to the market. There was no contribution by the owner of the boot making business. It was all the workers who did all the work. So the $10 should be distributed to them. Excuse me, my English I can stumble on it sometimes. The $10 should be distributed amongst them.
But wouldn't you say that the market provides an incentive for employers to treat their workers equitably? In the sense that you'd have the whole point of capitalism is that you don't just have one company working in isolation. You would have lots of different companies all working on different boots. And the whole point of competition, it's partly about ensuring that that companies that treat their workers equitably tend to attract their own workforces, because people don't want to usually work for companies that pay them less than their market value. But it also benefits the consumer, and the consumer is something that's often neglected in this kind of equation. And the consumer
as well.
So go ahead. So
so 2 things. I'll deal with does the free market provide for this? I mean, it's a nice idea, but if you look at it historically, let's look at the country where I hail from, Chile. After the man, yours truly on this picture, was killed, or committed suicide during the coup. Pinochet took over, and most of the business was deregulated, and supposedly this was allowing the free market to run freely. Hayek and Milton Friedman both praised the Chilean model as the ideal free market. And what were the working conditions? Absolute fucking dog shit. Like, people worked in terrible conditions, and the conditions didn't improve. There was no competition at giving the workers better conditions. It was all profit for the people who owned every business.
I'm not talking necessarily about a totally free market, and it's also worth bearing in mind that Augusto Pinochet was a dictator. You don't find capitalist dictatorships very often, but they do exist, and the Chilean regime was an example of a capitalist dictatorship. And I would tend to argue that in dictatorships, workers' rights don't tend to be a priority. I would say that the fact that Pinochet was a monstrous, murderous dictator at least partially explains that. But I would also say that Chile, now it is a democracy, has got it is the most affluent, wealthiest, and most prosperous country in South America.
It's also one of
and it's also that, it has this traditional modern Western capitalist type economy going on, unlike a lot of its neighbors.
It's also one of the most politically violent ones, but I don't want to get into it. I don't think it would be fair, because I have a lot more knowledge than you do, simply from growing up there. But it's not all the peaches and roses that it's told abroad. I'll just say that much.
No. I mean, like I say, there's no utopia. There's no. I would not argue from my position that capitalism is perfect in any sense, and I wouldn't even argue that the most capitalist countries are the best. Like I say, that there are. Singapore is probably one of the most capitalist countries in the world, but it has a lot of problems. Whereas somewhere like Norway, which has probably one of the highest standards of living in the world, is decidedly less free market than somewhere like Singapore or Taiwan. So I'm not trying to defend the free market in absolute terms. What I'm trying to defend is the modern Western mixed economic model, which I think has proven itself empirically as the most successful model we've ever seen in the history of humanity. It's the only one that's given us the sort of affluence and prosperity that would allow us to have this conversation.
You know what? I would agree with you here. There is a interesting communist philosopher. His name is Slavoj Žižek, who made this the same point. He said that social democracy was created some of the best standards of living. However, he claims that this time is over since the 2008 housing crash. And I don't know if you look at the GDP growth and the GDP rate of a lot of countries, but it looks as if there is another crash coming, if not upon us already. He said that the crashes are only getting worse. And if you're looking at this crash, which a lot of people are saying is hailing from Greece, the tools that we used to deal with the old crash are not working anymore. Austerity did not help Greece, and it has now spread throughout the world. And I don't know if you are too familiar with the way the global economics that plays out, but if one economy suffers, that economy imports and exports to from other countries and to other countries. So if that market crashes, they're no longer importing, so the countries that were selling to them, they suffer a little bit, and they're no longer exporting. So the countries that relied on that country to supply their industries, they suffer. And this just creates a ripple effect. That's what happened with the 2008 housing crash. And that's why it was so scary. That's why you had so many politicians trying to really mobilize their political currency to get the austerity to fix the 2008 housing crash. And now we have Greece, where they tried the same thing and it didn't work. So as this ripples throughout, and they keep trying to use countries continue to keep trying to use austerity, that means that they have to cut back on a lot of the social programs. There's going to be less. There won't be free daycare in France. There won't be universal healthcare in most countries in Europe if the crashes continue and the same tools are and the countries continue to try to use the same tools to deal with the crash.
I mean, I'm not going to disagree with the fact that if you open yourself up to market forces, you are going to get these downturns and boom periods. You are going to get periods where you have times of economic depravity. That is going to happen. I'm not going to disagree with that. But my main point here is that this is still better than the alternative. You get lots of countries that completely insulate themselves from the world markets, and they are more insulated in the sense that these global financial crashes will affect them less for the reasons that you've just said. They don't have to worry so much about the imports and exports from other countries affecting their markets. Then they're more self-reliant in that sense, but they're also a lot poorer. The disadvantage to not opening yourself up onto the world markets, I would say, significantly outweigh the advantages to being overly protectionist, to being insular, to being isolationists. I mean, you mentioned when we were setting up this debate, North Korea, which I think is a good example in the sense that North Korea is one of the most isolated economies in the world. I mean, there is some trade going on between China and North Korea, mostly in coal, but it's a very insular country, and North Korea wasn't affected so much by the global crash. But the reason it wasn't affected so much by the global crash is because it has a more self-reliant economy. But North Korea has also, at the same time, got one of the highest rates of poverty, deprivation in the world. It's a totally horrible place to live. So my point is that yes, your point about these global financial crashes that's valid, and I do agree that this is a problem. That this is a problem that we're going to possibly have to accept, that these crashes are going to happen in the future. But I think it's still better than the alternative.
I mean, I agree. Where it happens, it's good. But as with the economic upturns and downturns, it's a constant risk. And I don't know if you've seen, but oftentimes when countries try to how does a country like perhaps let's just say Mozambique, how do they get to social democracy state? How do they develop the country if all their if most of the resources are constantly just being exported and very little investment is down there. Perhaps that's not the ideal example, because they are a democratically socialist country, I believe. I'm not, perhaps not anymore, but how does a third world nation get to the social democratic position of with a mixed economy?
Well, I mean, we can look at China. That's an example of a country that did used to be communist, and now I would say, again, people tend to abuse this term a lot, but I would say China is a very good example of a country that is state capitalist. I think people tend to abuse that term. They call North Korea state capitalist, for example, which I would strongly argue against. But I think China is a good example of a country that really is state capitalist, and we've seen how free trade between China and the rest of the world has improved the standard of living in China. Now, don't get me wrong, China is still a dictatorship in all senses of the word, but the state of living in China has got a lot better, thanks mostly to free trade. So there is the way to improve the standard of living for someone living in the third world is to simply open up our markets to that person. And this is partly why I was against the EU, right? Because the EU is exploitative in the sense that it has these tariff barriers that go around Europe, which means that if you're someone living in a third world, you will struggle to sell something onto the world market because you have industry that's protected within the European tariff barrier that is at an artificially higher price. So these countries can't compete and actually end up importing things like food that they would be better at producing themselves. So I think there's definitely a case for saying that if you want to improve the standard of living for someone in the third world, you can go, I mean, regardless of whether we're talking social democracy or something slightly more Thatcherite, regardless of that, you can make something into a modern Western democracy. The easiest way to do that is to open your markets and trade freely with them. That's not to say we should be trading arms with Saudi Arabia, though. Again, there's some nuance to be had here.
Okay, I would agree with you there, but if we took China, I would dispute the idea that China's that their quality of life has improved mostly due to opening up trade. I'd say most of that was done because of the industrialization that was created, and that mostly it's complicated. By the central planning of the party and the state, where they developed the country and managed to provide for the people, and then once they have now that they have an industrial strong economic base, they can open up trade and they can compete. But oftentimes, if a small country with very little industrialization opens up their the trade, they can't bargain for competitive prices, because oftentimes there's something that they need, either if it's not food or light or heavy industry equipment, and they're continuously pushed out and unable to grow in wealth because their trade deals are just not good enough.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that it's not just highly populated and industrialized countries like China where this has been excess. I mean, I brought this example up before, but Singapore is effectively a city-state. It's tiny and it has next to no national resources. And the way Singapore survives and has become so phenomenally successful is by essentially having no tariff barriers at all. They've got an average tariff rate of 0.0%. They have almost completely free trade there. And I'm not saying Singapore is the nicest place to live, but what I am saying is that its standard of living is very good in comparison with the rest of the region. It's not as good as maybe living in Western Europe, but its standard of living is still nevertheless good for the region that it's in. So this principle doesn't just apply to industrialized countries like China. The whole concept has applied to more of Asia as a whole, that when you tend to get freer trade between countries, the standard of living tends to go up, and you tend to get more democratization of the country as well. I don't think it's a coincidence to say that the vast majority of dictatorships had centralized economies. Again, we brought up Augusto Pinochet, that was an exception, but the vast majority of dictatorships do indeed have centralized economies, and I don't think that's a coincidence.
I know you asked not to focus on Singapore too much, but I would say that the reason why Singapore has so low tariffs and they can be so successful is because they're in a very they're in an area where there's a very high amount of traffic, so they can have low tariffs, and the trade traffic will go through there regardless. But a country like Cuba, they wouldn't be so successful at that, I would say.
No, but I mean, clearly opening themselves up to free trade is.
Well, and they're doing just that. Like, there's no, just because you're a communist nation doesn't mean that you cannot trade with other capitalist nations. Often it doesn't happen because of it hasn't happened historically because of the Cold War and the political situation at hand. And I would wager to say that if there was to be another communist revolution in a big country, it would go back to that because of the ideological differences between communism and capitalism. Communism does seek to destroy capitalism oftentimes.
I mean, the reason it's hard to have trade in a communist country is because trade is based on the principles of supply and demand.
Sorry, I'm getting. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Trade is based on the principles of supply and demand, and if you have a centralized economy, then these market forces aren't going to be at work. So you aren't going to have this idea where people try and reduce the prices of consumables, such that other people that value those consumables more than the consumables that they have can trade with them. You need to have this element of supply and demand to for something like that to work. And if the economy is centrally planned, that's not going to happen so much.
Sorry, 1 second. It's my boss, so I gotta take it.
Okay, you can get it. It's fine.
Okay, sorry for that. Could you say the question again? I
was just making the point that trade is based on supply and demand. I think you made the point yourself that I have something that I have a surplus of a consumable, but
okay. This idea of supply and demand, again, it comes from the perspective of scarcity. What a lot of communists would advocate is if you have a small scarce resource, rather than selling it at a very high price, you could just make more of it. Oftentimes, you could make let's say there's a mineral, you could mine more of it, do an effort for that. You can simply increase the production for a thing. Perhaps from a capitalist perspective, this is not a smart idea because you won't make as much money. But if you simply look at it from, do we have the capability to increase the output of this? Yes, then we can do so. So the way that a communist society can compete in the global trading, in global trade, is simply by investing more in a resource that they can export. Now, oftentimes the communist society will put a bigger emphasis on providing to their people what they need. However, if the people are already provided for, there's no reason why in the central plan they can make an emphasis to try to create more of a resource that they have a unique advantage at producing and selling it in the global market.
Well, my problem with this, again, when I come back to supply and demand, is how would this centralized authority be able to measure adequately the supply of all these quantities and the demand? So how essentially this boils down to how does the government or the centralized authority, whatever it happens to be, know exactly what I want? How do they know? And the thing about the market is that the market kind of automatically knows, because the market is simply based on individuals, in each individual's need. What they want, they will be willing to pay a price for. How does this centralized authority able to measure the supply and demand of every individual living in their society in the way that the market can?
You don't necessarily need to find every single individual. You just need to get it down to a margin of error small enough where you can simply provide enough. In Chile, there was a project called Proyecto Cibersin, which was basically this. With the use of accounting and whatnot, the the productivity of certain businesses was reported to the government, and they would input this into a system, into a computer program back in the 1970s, and it wasn't a complete model. It didn't necessarily calculate how one decision impacted everything, because obviously that would be very difficult, because small changes can impact can impact millions of things. But it was a rudimentary economic simulation that would assist the calculations of individual computers. By computers, these are people who are doing individual calculations, not actually electronics. And with this, I don't know if you're familiar, but there was a CIA-supported trucking strike where the whole country was mostly paralyzed due to the inability for them to build railroads, and planes not really being a feasible solution to distribute just goods throughout the country. So without truckers, most of the country was paralyzed. So what the Allende government did, they asked for volunteers from civilians, and asking them, hey, could you truck shit for us, essentially. And essentially they had 10% of their former trucking capability, but supposedly attributed to Cybersyn, they managed to provide enough goods so that the economy could run at 70% of the previous efficiency, 100%, meaning that it could run just as efficiently. They managed to run at 70% efficiency with 10% of the trucking capability. So if you're asking whether or not this is feasible, well, I would point at this, that it was in the past, and it worked.
I mean, in a simulation, relatively small scale example, I mean, I would draw your attention to the empirical evidence that we have, that even when in a mixed economy, we have governments that bail out these large companies on the basis that they would say that these provide a service that we think people are going to need in the future. But at this current point, the market forces make such a company's position, it puts such a company in a bad position. So we're going to bail them out. We're going to give them the funds to get them set up again, and a few years down the line, people will benefit from that. Now it is the case that the bailouts are sometimes successful, but there are a lot of failures as well. The ability for humans to predict the state of the economy is pretty poor. I mean, economics is one of the few subject areas that you can get a lot of disagreement on. In something like physics or chemistry, you don't tend to get much of a disagreement. But there are lots of different economic models that all take into account all these different variables and try to make predictions, and the predictions tend to be quite bad. And this is because there are so many variables to account for in any economic model. Predictions become very, very difficult. So the whole problem with the centralized economy is that if you want to run a high efficiency, you have to make very good predictions. And I would argue that for all the faults of capitalism, at least capitalism has a way of very effectively measuring the supply and demand of every individual within that society, whereas a centralized economy will get it wrong, simply put, a lot of the time. And when it gets it wrong, it can have disastrous consequences.
Well, I suppose it's a shame that we couldn't have Cybersyn for a longer period of time, because it was only in place for 2 years. But for the 2 years that it existed, it did a good job. It worked. Also, I would point at China. They had a centrally planned economy, and basically China and Russia, the two countries that were centrally planned, both had the highest economic growth in the history of ever. So in the history of the recorded history of people. So
yeah, but their increased economic growth came at a time when they decentralized their economy. It was the decentralization of their economy which caused the rapid economic growth. And also, you can't really expect really high levels of economic growth in a country that is already modernized, westernized, and already has a mixed economy.
I agree, but look at contemporaries of Russia and China, at least where they were. Look at India. Look at most of Africa. Look at certain countries from Latin America. You only see this kind of growth from centrally planned economies.
But again, you're giving examples of countries that are decentralizing their economies. I mean, there's decentralization going on in these countries that you referred to. I mean, again, we can look at
but this economic growth, it goes back to in China to the 1940s and the Russia to the 1930s or the 1920s, even after the Civil War. This was a sustained growth throughout their industrialization period.
Oh yeah, but in China, the very rapid growth that we've seen occurred only in the 1980s. That's when the exponential growth in their economy happened. I mean, before the 1980s, China, you had one of those pie charts with all the world's economies on it. You wouldn't barely be able to see the China slice, despite the fact that China still had a relatively high population. Whereas now, China is the second largest economy in the world. It had that extremely rapid period of growth in the 1980s, and that coincided when the China began to decentralize its economy.
But you can't. No other country has been able to get to that position where they're in a position so that they can decentralize and have that kind of growth. Like you need to be able to industrialize from something. Like most of the countries, at least the countries I'm referring to, I'm not looking at first world nations. I'm looking at countries like Africa. Again, how do they get to this position where they can provide stuff like universal healthcare? How can they can provide free college or at least very cheap college subsidized by the government?
I mean, we can look at what the most prosperous country in Africa before 2014. I'm of course referring to Libya. I mean, Libya was probably the most prosperous country in Africa before the regime collapsed, and Colonel Gaddafi was originally sort of back in the sort of 70s and 80s, I believe. He was quite socialist orientated, but then sort of in recent decades, Libya has become a much more had become a much more open and free trading economy, and it was up until, of course, it collapsed in 2014, I think, that Libya became the most prosperous country in Africa. I mean, maybe with the exception of South Africa. I'm not sure. I think Libya was the most prosperous country in Africa.
You're correct. Libya was more prosperous.
Was South Africa what? So
Libya was more prosperous.
Okay, yeah. So I think it was, but again, it comes down to this sort of it comes down to the whole concept of opening your economy up to free trade, and I mean the reason why it makes people more prosperous is because when you insert an element of competition into your economy, which is the driving force behind capitalism, essentially, when you insert competition into your economy, you drive the prices down, because without competition, there's no incentive to produce better products more efficiently for a lower price. And when you drive the price down, obviously it becomes more affordable to the consumer. The reason that capitalism is so successful is because the consumer benefits so much from it. So it's not just about the worker, it's also about the consumer, as I mentioned earlier. So I would say that the points that I'm making are pretty applicable to Africa as well as Asia, especially with the Libya example.
I mean, but Africa has maintained a capitalist stance. I believe most of the countries have been "quote unquote" capitalist since the decolonization, and they're still not doing great. You don't see the same economic growth that you saw in the other economies.
I mean, of course, Africa has other problems as well. I mean, like a lot of the North African countries are theocracies, and of course, sort of a lot of the countries in the south are, I mean, like Somaliland. I mean, there's not really much of a state at all there. So, I mean, Africa has a lot of problems. But in recent years, Africa has improved, and part of that is due to increased amounts of trade. But again, there's still lots of problems in Africa, but I think what I would say is that one of the advantages of capitalism is that you tend to get systems that are stable when you have democracies as well. So capitalism and democracy tend to work quite well together. Whereas when you centralize an economy, you have to have complete control over the economy. So you tend to get a lot of systems that are quite stable dictatorships. So socialist dictatorships where you have absolute control over the economy.
I don't. Here's often communists like myself. Unlike a lot of my comrades, I tend to stay away from the communism was a democracy, because I often find you don't get anywhere with people who don't agree. But I suppose here that is the only argument. Mao was not this like central dictator that like got to say what went and what didn't in China. Neither was Lenin or Stalin or Khrushchev or any other Soviet leader. Neither is Castro. Oftentimes what happens is that these are very influential people, such as someone like George Washington or today perhaps Bernie Sanders, people who a lot of people look at them, or even Trump, people look at them and when you think of the United States, you think of these people. When you think of the Soviet Union, you think of Stalin, you think of Lenin. So there's this perception that they were very important to the country, and they were, but they didn't have that much political power compared to other lesser known representatives in the area.
Okay, I mean, these were still. I'm sorry. I'm just conscious of the time. We've got 6 minutes left, so I'm not sure how long we can continue.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't get into this with 6 minutes left. But if I could just say, I dispute this claim that these figures were absolute leaders, and I'm not going to say they were perfect and they never made any mistakes. No, Stalin made many mistakes. Lenin made many mistakes. Mao made many mistakes. So the Allende, so the Castro, and I hold them accountable for that. But don't give to the devil what belongs to the devil, and the rest, don't. I mean,
they killed more people than.
So did Nixon. So did Reagan. So did Bush. I'm not saying that one evil that the two evils make a right.
Yeah, but I mean,
this is a completely ideological point. It's like, oh, my enemy did a terrible thing, but let me disregard what my leaders have done.
Well, I'm not disregarding the problems of the US foreign policy, but you can't really compare the mass murder and starvation of their own people with a failed foreign policy in Iraq or Afghanistan.
If you're gonna tell me that the whole murder was caused by the Soviet Union, here, like I don't know what to tell you. That's like telling me that that Allende is to be faulted for the coup. I think it's ridiculous.
Sorry, the what?
Like the whole murder was the famine in the Soviet Union in 1932 or 1933. Oftentimes people try to attribute it to the Soviet Union because they because of how they tried to change the agricultural methods in the area. When I look at it, I see during Tsar's Russia up until 1933, after the revolution, there was famines historically. And then after this, the Soviet Union collectivized the farms, there was no more famines. So whatever the Soviet Union did, stopped the famines. So if you're attributing the famines with the Soviet Union, I just do not know what to tell you. It's just not the case.
I mean, even if I accept that point, the Soviet regime actually killed people directly. I mean, they murdered people. I mean,
okay. I mean, countries kill people, like, sometimes.
Yeah, but
this is what happens in a war.
Again, there's a difference between having a total failure of a foreign policy and butchering your own people.
This is like the United States killed its own people too. The Black Panther parties, the labor strike movement. Like this is like up until like as late as the 1970s, they were brutalizing their own people. Like during the civil rights movement, civil rights leaders were killed by the U.S. government. And if we compare the times equally, the 1933 Soviet Union and 1933 the United States, the labor rights movement, there were labor rights leaders engaging in open warfare with the U.S. military.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think there's a bit of a difference in scale here, but I mean, we have literally 3 minutes to go. I mean, I guess I want to keep this to under an hour. So I think, what do you want to do now? I mean,
I actually want to thank you for having people like myself, like Bad Mouse, so because we're very ideologically opposed. But I want to thank you for respecting and keeping it civil, because that is something that at least myself, I'm quite frustrated often with people when I mention this. They're like, oh, but all these awful things, and I'm like, yeah, well, your government is not so innocent either. And oftentimes I receive quite a lot of animosity for that. So I want to thank you for letting me on.
no, that's fine.
I very much appreciate it.
I mean, we can maybe do one of these again. I always enjoy having discussions, but yeah, we could have continued the conversation that we were having for a good while
We
longer.
we could go on until we both drop dead from starvation.
Yeah, the only reason I want to conclude, it doesn't have to be exactly an hour, but the reason that I want to conclude after an hour is that I have noticed that when you have when it says on the views 2 hours, I mean, I don't watch 2 hour hangouts.
I do, man. That is my guilty pleasure, man.
I mean, so I want to keep it short for the people watching, and also I think if we do it too long, you won't be able to get the copyright anyway to put it on your own channel. So I think, yeah, I mean that was a discussion. I mean, so did you want to make any concluding remarks?
Thank you once again.
Okay.
If you agree with either one of us, subscribe to us, and
yeah,
you probably won't like the other one's content as much.
This will be on both of our channels. I'll put the copyright at CC so you can upload it directly onto your channel, and we'll do that. So thanks everyone that's listened. I know a few people have.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching.